Tonight on Primetime Politics, tariff rulings.
The government welcomes yesterday's decision by the U.S. Court of International Trade, which is consistent with Canada's long-standing position.
We're going to fight them in court, and we're going to win.
A hectic day in the U.S. courts with two earlier rulings striking down Trump tariffs against Canada and other countries. But a third reinstates them until an appeal can be heard. What will Canadian officials take away from the legal wrangling? We'll get into the issue. Also, we'll speak with the Assembly of First Nations National Chief to hear how the Prime Minister responded to her concerns over housing, clean water, and pipelines. Plus, our political strategist on Mark Carney's debut in Question Period. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Well, we begin tonight with the state of Canada-U.S. trade. We have seen a few court rulings in the U.S. in the last 24 hours, all of them addressing Trump tariffs imposed on several countries, including Canada. Now, it all began late yesterday evening, a U.S. federal court ruling that much of the Trump administration's tariffs were invalid. The Court of International Trade saying the president did not have the authority to level those tariffs under the guise of an economic emergency. And then today, a second court came to the same conclusion. But by late this afternoon, a federal court of appeal in the United States put everything on hold, saying the tariffs will stand for now until an appeal from the White House is heard. A little chaotic, yes, but we did speak earlier today to Peter Van Loan, former international trade minister in the Harper government, and he says rulings against tariffs, if they stand, could rob the Trump administration of leverage when Canada and the United States renegotiate CUSMA.
I think we're heading into a renegotiation of that trade agreement with the United States. And this takes away leverage that Donald Trump had for that renegotiation. And his whole point in these tariffs, I believe, has been at core to achieve leverage. In fact, if you read the court decision, they actually say with respect to the fentanyl tariffs, the trafficking tariffs, that was the purpose of it, to achieve leverage over Canada to achieve other objectives in Mexico. And they basically dismissed that, but it's interesting that the federal government in the states acknowledged that that was the objective. And now we're in a position, I think, where some of that leverage is lost. So Canada comes to that negotiating table in a stronger position, and that is good news.
Okay, well, that's an interesting bit of analysis. Although, you know, there are those that question whether or not it's even worthwhile to reopen negotiations, particularly with this administration, when they so readily ignore the one that this president negotiated when he threw away the original NAFTA.
Well, he, of course, has conveniently forgotten that in any public utterance he's made, that this is his trade agreement, which I think he, at the time, declared the best trade agreement ever. Mm-hmm. But once he has a new trade agreement negotiated, I think that we will be able to count on that going forward, at least for the balance of his term. So that's, it's a reality. Canada requires trade. It would be nice to think we can go it alone. That's just not realistic, not on this continent, and not in 2025.
And our thanks to former International Trade Minister Peter Van Loan. Now take a listen to some of the reaction we heard earlier today from Prime Minister Carney to the earlier rulings from the U.S. courts.
The government welcomes yesterday's decision by the U.S. Court of International Trade, which is consistent with Canada's long-standing position that the U.S. IEEPA tariffs were unlawful as well as unjustified. That said, we recognize that our trading relationship with the United States is still profoundly and adversely threatened and affected by similarly unjustified 232 tariffs against steel, aluminum, and the auto sector, as well as continuing threats of tariffs against other strategic sectors, including lumber, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals. It therefore remains the top priority of Canada's new government to establish a new economic and security relationship with the United States and to strengthen our collaboration with reliable trading partners and allies around the world.
Well, to Saskatchewan now, where the Premier declared a state of emergency today. That order standing for the next 30 days. This as wildfires continue to spread across the northern part of the province, and those fires drive thousands of people out of their homes.
It's a very serious situation that we're faced with in Saskatchewan. We do need some rainfall. We need that sooner rather than later. And in light of that not being in the forecast, we most certainly are putting in place every measure possible to prepare our province, prepare our communities, and prepare those that live in our northern communities that are threatened by these wildfires in the days ahead.
Saskatchewan's declaration follows Manitoba's state of emergency that was announced yesterday evening. And in Manitoba's case, some 17,000 people are expected to be evacuated in the coming days. This as wildfires spread through the northern and eastern parts of that province. Yesterday, Prime Minister Carney did send out a message on social media. It says the following, that he had been in contact with Premier Wabkanu of Manitoba, and he says Ottawa stands at the ready to help Manitobans' provincial wildfire teams. Well, a number of the communities being evacuated are Indigenous as well. And earlier today, I did speak with Mandy Masty. She is the new Minister of Indigenous Services. And I asked her how the ministry is helping residents on the ground.
Indigenous Service Canada has a responsibility to really respond to emergency preparedness, helping to coordinate with evacuation, doing it in a way that is culturally sensitive, empowering the communities to really determine where it is they want to go, how they can get there in a space that feels safe. Of course, this also requires coordination across ministries, so I'm really pleased that we were able to exchange with Minister Chartrand, whose own riding was affected by these fires. This is the case not only in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, in Ontario, and Alberta. We are tracking and looking at the state of how things are moving forward there. The wildfires have started early. There's a critical response. I'm really pleased to see that the Minister from Emergency Management also issued critical responses to requests for the Canadian Armed Forces to come in and support those areas that really are in a state of emergency, literally looking for urgent response.
And our thanks to Mandy Masty, the Minister of Indigenous Services. Now, we did also go on to discuss other matters. You can find the full conversation online, but also we will tell you that we'll continue to follow the wildfire situation in the prairies, and we'll bring you updates in the days to come. Well, Canada Sovereign has always had a special relationship with the Indigenous peoples of this country. Seen as a guardian of the treaties signed with the First Nations, King Charles acknowledged the relationship in this week's speech from the throne, acknowledging his own journey of reconciliation while encouraging Canadians to continue theirs.
I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. This land acknowledgement is a recognition of shared history as a nation, while continuing to deepen my own understanding. It is my great hope that in each of your communities and collectively as a country, a path is found toward truth and reconciliation in both word and deed.
Well, for more, we're now joined by Cindy Woodhouse-Nepenak, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Chief, good to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So we just heard the King in the Senate earlier this week, which I'll ask you about later because you did have a meeting with the King. But you, right now, have just come out of a meeting with the Prime Minister. I'm wondering how that went, because this is the first time in this parliamentary session that you've actually met with the Prime Minister. What did you talk about?
Well, I congratulated the Prime Minister on his election, and it was a chance to also congratulate him on a successful royal visit, as well as the speech from the throne that for the first time in the history of this country had free, prior, and informed consent in it. I'd also congratulated him on appointing 2 First Nations women to cabinet. I think that's huge. And we also talked about the urgent situation regarding forest fires in the prairies, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and in Ontario, and to make sure that, that the chiefs that are calling, that they're getting the support that they need for their community. So we conveyed that message very strongly. We also talked about urgent legislative and policy priorities, particularly related to clean water legislation and First Nations policing. You know, we really need access to policing services on First Nations across the country. And we also talked about the Team Canada, that we talked about Trump and the tariffs and the need to include First Nations formally in these national discussions. Currently, we're not.
Yeah.
Particularly with First Ministers. It's not Team Canada in 2025 without First Nations at the table.
Well, let's talk about a few of those matters, beginning with the concerns and the needs of Indigenous communities in this country. Because yesterday you did have a news conference where you talked about this infrastructure gap with Indigenous communities in this country. Clean water, yes, but also schools and homes. I'm wondering if you received any type of commitment whatsoever from the Prime Minister that he would move forward and address these issues.
We had a commitment on homes for sure for First Nations, but I think it's got to be more than that. I was able to restate that closing the discriminatory First Nations infrastructure gap should be the #1 national building project. This gap has perpetuated deep-rooted inequality in Canada, particularly related to safe schools for our kids, to access to clean water for our kids, to modern schools, to access to high-speed internet, very, very basic things, all-season roads and other issues that Canadians take for granted. Many First Nations children and people and elders don't have access to those things. And this disparity has led to poorer health outcomes, limited education opportunities, as you can imagine, and much less to that than compared to other Canadians. So we made the point that if the government's vision for First Nations infrastructure is focused exclusively on accessing natural resources, that they have another thing coming. We need to start with the basics to make sure that basic human rights are being met. And what better way to mark the 10th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliations Commission than closing Canada's shameful infrastructure gap once and for all?
Mm-hmm. And how did he respond to that?
Well, you know, he was taking notes, and we had a long discussion. We're going to be having further meetings with our leadership and himself, as well as with his ministers. So we're going to be working on that and finding a date for that.
Okay, so you and I will speak again as that date approaches and as that meeting happens. But you know, you also talk about these national projects, because we do know that this is something that the government wants to pursue, national projects vis-a-vis natural resources. Do you see that as a boon for Indigenous people in this country or a danger?
Well, I can't even comment on that because we have not seen this legislation, just a brief outline. Just a brief outline. So we will wait to see the full package. That being said, we are concerned about what we are seeing and hearing from government so far, based on what I'm hearing, and about similar proposals in Ontario, in British Columbia, and Alberta. So we fear that this may not end well. We won't beat Trump's colonialism with more colonialism here at home. And I fear that is what we are seeing with this fast-track proposals approach. We promised the Prime Minister we will provide a more formal response that lists the concerns we are hearing and observing with this current approach, and we will be consulting chiefs and providing that to them very soon. At the same time, I told the Prime Minister that nation-building projects he should fast-track is right in front of him, closing the First Nations infrastructure gap.
Mm-hmm. And to be clear for people at home, you're still waiting for details on the federal approach. What you're referencing right now are the provincial efforts to try to fast-track developments in their own regions. So, you know, again, we'll watch that along with you. But you also talk about sitting down with the premiers, and that's interesting because for people who don't know, next week in Saskatoon, there will be a meeting of the First Ministers. In the past, you've expressed your frustration that there never is Indigenous leadership around that table when the premiers meet. I'm wondering if you raised that specifically with the Prime Minister, and whether or not you asked to be invited to Saskatoon this year.
I did raise that, and I feel for previous national chiefs before myself who were never invited to any of these big discussions. And it's 2025. It's time that First Nations have a full seat at the table. You cannot leave them out when you're talking about infrastructure or healthcare, and you want to divvy up and do healthcare with each other with the premiers, but they all play politics with it all the time and try and push First Nations to the sidelines. And we need to get over that and make this country a better place for all of us. The King was here this past week to show, and this country was made because First Nations signed treaties with the Crown at the time to create this beautiful country that we're supposed to be creating. We're still a young country. Let's get it right and make space for First Nations at the table.
Will there be space made for you in Saskatoon, though?
I have not heard.
Okay, not yet heard. Although, let's get back to the King, though, because, of course, before you and I were speaking, we heard the King in the Senate delivering the throne speech. And in the portion, just one of many portions of that speech where he did reference Canada's Indigenous, Inuit and Métis people, First Nations people, in that one reference with the land acknowledgement, he himself acknowledged that he was still on the path of learning and encouraged Canadians to continue their path on the road to reconciliation. How important do you think that was to hear, not only for Indigenous peoples in this country, but for other people in this country as well, to hear that kind of message from the head of state?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I think, like I said, we're a young country, and I think that we all have to learn about each other. I mean, I lived in a First Nation where, I was I'm happy that I grew up on a First Nation community, but coming off that, I had to learn about other cultures as well. And I'm so glad that I've met so many wonderful Canadians from coast to coast to coast with their families to try and understand each other and where we're coming from. And, I know many times when I would explain being a First Nations person that we're First Nations, like the Inuit aren't subjected to this, neither are the Métis, but First Nations people, the 1.5 million people in Canada, we're the only people legislated around the entire world through the Indian Act. And the Indian Act was after the signing of treaties, like a decade later in the House of Commons. And it's created an unjust society for First Nations in this country. And if we want to make, we're still, look at it, it's 2025, we're still talking about access to clean drinking water for First Nations children and access to basic things like the internet for First Nations children and roads and schools and homes. And so we have a long way to go in this young country that we all share, but we all need to learn from each other, work together, and talk to each other. And nobody's leaving, nobody's leaving this country. We have to try and get along and find a way forward to make this country a more wholesome, better place for each and every one of us.
Mm-hmm. And before we go, I do want to ask, because you asked for and did receive a private audience with the King. I'm wondering what you shared with King Charles.
Well, I was wearing a treaty medal. I don't have it with me today, but I was wearing a treaty medal, and on the treaty medal, and on one side was his great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, and the treaty medal was, when treaties were entered into, was gifted to my grandfather, my ancestor, Chief Richard Woodhouse, back on August 21st, 1871. So we talked about that and creating this peaceful country. We never went to war with each other. And we entered into treaty together. And so we had a long discussion on treaties. We had a long discussion on sustainable development goals. We had a long discussion on, furthering our relationship together, and that we, I'm hoping that I take it, work with him and for a further meeting. And so I'm looking forward to that.
Well, I wish you well in that conversation and in your next meeting with the King, Cindy. But listen, for our conversation this evening, thank you for all the update. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too. Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Stepinac. Well, we're now in the midst of Canada's 45th Parliament, and on Wednesday we did see Mark Carney's debut in question period. And to talk about this and what it sets up for the session ahead, we're now joined by our strategist, Liberal Susan Smith, co-founder and principal at Blue Sky Strategy Group, Conservative strategist Cole Hogan, and former NDP Director of Communications, now founder and principal at On Step Strategies, George Soule. Hello to all of you.
Hello.
Nice to have you all back. So listen, Mark Carney, he makes his debut, as I say, Wednesday during question period. Throughout the whole campaign and really in his leadership run, he talked about elevating debate in the House of Commons. I'm going to play for you the first exchange, and you give me your thoughts. Take a look at what happened in the House of Commons earlier this week.
If he's the man with the plan and the guy you hire in a crisis, why won't he table a budget before he goes on summer vacation?
Mr. Speaker, I understand the member of the opposition is very busy. Didn't have a chance to study closely the 100-day plan of the former member from Ottawa, Carleton, which did not include a budget.
Okay, so the first exchange from the Prime Minister, what do you make of that? Is that the I guess the definition of elevation and debate?
I think it was same old from Andrew Scheer. I mean, we remember him when he was the leader of the party as well before he got stepped down. Mr. Carney, I think, had to come out with some energy. For sure, he handled questions in French and English, no notes. He seemed very comfortable. I think there's a difference between his tone and the sloganeering of Mr. Scheer. That's why I said kind of same old. So I think one side you heard very similar. The other side, Mr. Carney, I think, fielded questions well. The other big difference is he's not taking all the questions on Wednesdays. Going back to what Chrétien, Harper, and prime ministers have always done, they take the leaders' questions and they allow their front bench to speak. And I think that's an important shift in the House of Commons too. So there are rookie ministers who are, reading off their papers. They're going to have to come along. But then you see people like Gregor Robertson, who's been a municipal politician, stand up and handle the questions, no notes, quite well. So hopefully question period improves. Canadians want it to.
Cole?
Sure. I think Mark Carney did an excellent job in question period. I think he handled it very well, and I understand, the intention to shift things beyond the way that the Trudeau government operated and differentiate themselves as a new government. What I want to see long-term is how the rest of the cabinet performs, particularly in the House, where we've seen a little bit of a gap in messaging between Mark Carney and his ministers. Has been, instances where his finance minister said, well, maybe we won't have a budget this year, and Mark Carney came back and said, no, we absolutely will have a budget. And another instance where we had Stephen Guilbeault say, perhaps we have enough pipeline infrastructure, maybe we don't need to build anymore. And then, Guilbeault was asked yesterday, I believe it was, do you think Canada has enough conventional energy? And he said, well, I'm no longer the minister responsible for that. So perhaps, Mark Carney and his PMO have, laid down the law of the land with the Trudeau-era ministers to really differentiate Carney's government from Trudeau's.
George, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, having Mr. Scheer come in as leader is a clear indication that Mr. Poilievre is worried about anybody else who might take over. There's any number of other people that are competent within that caucus, but Mr. Scheer's already been rejected by Canadians and the Conservatives, and so he's not going to take over. I mean, the fact that he's using the same old tone that they've always used is a bit strange. I also thought, for Mark Carney, somebody who was hired to sit across the the room from Donald Trump, which by the way, I think he did well on that front, in the House, to kind of be smart-ass too. I think it kind of misses the point of what I think Canadians are hoping for from the Liberals, kind of pointing out, Poilievre lost his seat. And I think again, the tone needs to change in the House, especially right now, especially while we're trying to move towards Donald Trump being the main focus. So I think that was a missed opportunity. When you talk about Gregor Robertson coming off script, good for him, but the last time we saw him come off script, he said that they were not going to do anything to reduce housing prices. So again, the new ministers are struggling with the message, and I think that's partly because this is the Mark Carney government, and room for other people to squeeze in is going to be tough.
I think it takes time for everybody to find their feet in a new government. And I expect, a half stumble or something along the way there on the government side. What really surprised me is how negative or how similar the tone is. So Mr. Poilievre's not in the House, but he's still pulling the puppet strings. He's still jumping in front of the cameras before question period to say, hi, hey, remember me? But he's not giving Canadians anything that's different.
Okay, I'll let you quickly say something that
Sure. We've seen Poilievre in particular say, we are open to working with the Liberal government in a few areas. He said, we'd love Mark Carney's government to steal our ideas because, as he was saying, Conservatives have the best ideas and policies. He's also indicated, his support for the Liberal income tax cut. The Conservatives want to see it go a little further. And I think those are areas where you'll see them cooperate with the Liberals, especially on good faith efforts on Canadian energy and reducing our reliance on the United States.
Okay, listen, I'm going to get to Mr. Poilievre in a second, but I do want to pick up on a point because, Tonda McCharles, the Toronto Star Ottawa bureau chief, she had an interesting article today regarding the Liberal caucus, because the MPs have essentially been told, apparently by the PMO, to not mention past accomplishments of the former Liberal government under Justin Trudeau, except except for childcare, pharmacare, dental care. I'm kind of wondering what that might do to caucus unity. Those who have been re-elected, proud of the time that they've served as a Liberal, to be told not to brag about it at a time when, concurrently, many reports say there is right now disunity, unhappy backbench Liberal MPs, Susan.
Oh, I'm kind of hearing the opposite, actually.
Really?
Yeah. No, but I actually, I was talking to someone today, and I was talking to someone today, actually, and I think Mr. Carney's putting some things in place that are really different from the Trudeau government. Trudeau's PMO was criticized for not being able to connect with members of Parliament, like her not doing a great job connecting with his caucus or listening to his caucus. Gone are chiefs of staff and staff in caucus meetings. Caucus members will be able to speak freely. I think there's going to be some really significant liaison between the an MP who will speak to the Prime Minister really regularly. We've seen the rumors about parliamentary secretaries, and they'll have roles and voices in the House of Commons. So I think that is definitely going to be different. Look, people are excited to be back under a new Prime Minister. It's fair for any new Prime Minister to put their mark on the mandate that they have been elected to have and want to execute. There are always people who are grumpy who don't make caucus, or a few people waiting to see if they make cabinet, few people waiting to see if they'll make parliamentary secretaries. But I would say, writ large, people are pretty happy to be there. They like the leadership. It's a change of style, and it's going to be very outcome-driven. So produce. Yeah,
but at the same time, Cole, being told, but don't brag about past accomplishments. What does that do to caucus unity? Because interesting to see what you're saying, because certainly in Ottawa, there's discussion of the opposite happening right now within the caucus.
Yeah, and that might be a tough tune for some of the Trudeau ministers and members of caucus who are proud of a lot of those accomplishments. But clearly, and I think this is something Mark Carney has to do. He has to differentiate himself from Justin Trudeau's legacy and run a totally separate government. And, it's incumbents on the entirety of the House to, take what they're doing in good faith, what Mark Carney's government presents, and if it's different than the Trudeau government, I think they'll get support across the House.
George?
Yeah, I don't think this is really a surprise, frankly. They ran a change election. That was the attempt. Mark Carney was saying this is a new government, and now they're still saying that. But I do think it's going to be tough for folks who've been around for the last 10 years, or at least a chunk of it, who have worked hard for that legacy. And as much as they understood this was a change election, and for sure, they're happy to be sitting on that side of the House, and the ones who got in the cabinet are happy to have the limousines and all the stuff that comes with it. But as far as the things they worked for, to be told that is not part of what they, the muscle memory is going to be hard for them to adjust to. And I think the bigger challenge is going to be, and I know Mark Carney is going to delay a budget till 2026, maybe at this point. Maybe
the fall. He says the fall. He says the fall.
We'll see what kind of fall. We'll see what kind of budget it is. Because the message was pretty clear for a while until it was a problem, and then all of a sudden it's going to be a budget. We'll see how big a budget it is. But when that one might be just another kind of intermediate one. But when we get the full real budget in the next spring, I think you're going to see a Paul Martin style budget. And I think those same folks who have been so supportive of the kind of more progressive Justin Trudeau style Liberal Party are going to be shocked to be reminded that the Liberal Party can be something very, very different.
Okay. Well, listen, we are watching. I said I was going to talk about Pierre Poilievre, but I love you guys. We've run out of time. So we'll pick up. Nice to be back. Parliament's back in session, so we'll see you again next week. Susan, Cole, George, thank you for the time.
Thank you so much.
Michael.
And that is Primetime Politics for this Thursday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow. Until then, take care.